Good afternoon to those in the UK, good evening to those in Japan, and a warm welcome back to this quarterly Japan Society webinar, hosted jointly with Asia Society Tokyo. I am Bill Emmett. I'm an honorary vice chair of the Japan Society, and it is my great pleasure to moderate these Japan Macro Salons, reviewing the latest trends in Japan's economy, financial markets, and corporate world, and of course, how those trends affect and are affected by global events. Currently, those global events often seem dominated by tariff announcements coming from the White House. So just as our previous salon took place on Donald Trump's so-called Liberation Day of tariff announcements on April the 2nd, so this salon is taking place the day after he has threatened Japan and South Korea with tariff rates of 25% on their goods imports into the United States. Equally important, however, is the fact that this salon comes just after campaigning has begun for Japan's upper house elections on July the 20th. As our regular attendees know, every quarter in these salons to discuss these issues, I'm joined by our good friend Jesper Koll. Jesper is well known as a self-described Japan optimist, but also for more than 3 decades as one of the highest-rated economists and strategists in Japan. Jesper has worked with the best, including JP Morgan and Merrill Lynch, and is now an expert director at the Monex Group, as well as a board director at the Okinawa Institute for Science and Technology, and of course, he is an advisor to us all. As always, we will also be joined by a special guest. I'm delighted to say that this quarter's guest will be Kaori Iida, who, as Deputy Chief Commentator at NHK, is thoroughly steeped in the world of US-Japan trade, of Japanese investments in the US and elsewhere, and of course of the upper house elections. Iida-san has served in both Los Angeles and Washington, D.C. for NHK, and most recently was director of the Digital News Division and editor of NHK's nightly news program Newswatch 9. Iida-san will join us in about 15 minutes' time, but first, as usual, I want to begin by picking Jesper's brains about recent economic trends. Throughout the webinar, please feel free to submit questions at any time using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and to vote for others' questions to bring them more quickly to my attention. We'll get on soon, no doubt, to tariffs and, of course, to Nippon Steel's surprising success with its investment in US steel. But first, I'd like to ask about what are inevitably the pocketbook issues in this month's elections, the cost of living and the continued fall in real incomes. Jesper, what sort of impact is this having? Inflation, falling real incomes, rising rice prices, even young Mr. Koizumi can't turn this round, I imagine.
No, and Bill, you put your finger on the pulse. There is no question that inflation now for literally the last 4 or 5 months has been surprising on the upside, even for the bullish people. I mean, all in, consumer prices rising by 3.7%. I've just come back from a little debate at the Bank of Japan. And look, the reality is we've now had 38 months of consumer prices rising faster than the 2% inflation target that the Bank of Japan has. And what is exciting from an economist perspective is the reality of the drivers behind inflation actually changing. It all started, of course, with yen depreciation and rising energy prices. So you had a terms of trade shock that started, inflation here in Japan. But over the last 6, 7 months, there is increasing evidence that it's not supply, but that it is demand pull inflation that is now starting to come into play. And in particular, Bill, look at service sector prices. You find service sector prices steadily increasing now. So yes, people want to talk about the rice price, and that obviously is a big issue, since it's a homegrown issue. This is not because of the weak yen or because of some supply disruption by the nasty Americans. This is a homegrown problem, and it becomes very clear that Japan's agricultural policy, the rice policy in particular, over the last 20, 30 years, is just not modernized. It's just not capable of actually supplying, the needs of the Japanese people. And so that makes the people very angry. And I actually think that, the groundswell of anger that the Japanese people have with inflation running away, and as a result of that, holding the LDP accountable, how can you have mismanaged this, right, to such an extent? And let me add one final point to that, which is that particularly hard hit are Japan's pensioners. Because if and you can actually show in the data, if you live off a pension in Japan, which is almost 28% of all the households in Japan now live off a pension. If you live off a pension in Japan, your disposable income has actually fallen by more than 30% over the last 2 years. And that's, of course, because entitlements are being cut back. The pension payouts are actually being cut back. And in the session of parliament that just ended, Prime Minister Ishiba, all they did is agree to postpone a discussion on what to do with the pension payouts. So this is hurting the pensioners. And now remember, pensioners, as I mentioned, about 1/3 of the population, but they are basically 2/3 of all the voters. So it's the angry people it's the pensioners that are being hurt by inflation. They venting their anger, and we shall see. Personally, I think it doesn't look very good, for the LDP and indeed for the Komeito as well.
I see. That's very interesting. I see our friend Tobias Harris, who was the special guest, I think, in the January salon of this series. He's just put out a forecast, obviously based on opinion polls and on analyzing the difference between the different member districts, under which he forecasts that LDP Komeito will hang on to their majority in the upper house by about 7 seats. But that depends on the opinion polls being accurate. And I suppose a straw in his wind on his side was the sense that this rising young party, Sanseito, the populist right, if you like, the youngster party, might take votes away from the other opposition parties as much as from the LDP. But how do you see those political runes?
My view is, as you know, I spent the first 3 years of my life in Japan sort of working as an aide to a member of parliament. And you should never underestimate, the viciousness and the lack of transparency of what goes on in the individual election districts. So, there's a significant margin of error. And we shall see. I personally, am more convinced that, unfortunately, the anger amongst the populace, is larger. You've got the inflation issue, which is, remember, Bill, we've had one generation of zero inflation or modest deflation. We've now had effectively real wages, right? If you aggregate this out, real wages have fallen now, for basically the last 6 months. And there was just a brief blip up because inflation came down after the COVID, thing. But effectively, you've had real wages falling for almost 3 years now. So, there is a discontent, and I think the LDP is gonna take it on the chin here. Now, to switch to something a little bit more optimistic, Bill. The exciting thing is, yes, we've got the discontent forced by inflation for the consumers, for the Japanese people, the pensioners in particular. On the positive side of things, the corporate metabolism is on fire. And you've just had the Tankan survey by the Bank of Japan. And basically, the sentiment indicators were all stable, which is great given the uncertainty that we've got in the world. But more importantly, capital expenditure, business investment, was revised up significantly from around 1% to almost 7%, for the current financial year, which is one of the biggest increases. And remember, it comes on top of 2 strong years of business investment expenditure already. So the corporate metabolism, right, in terms of Japanese corporations, whether they are large companies, whether they're industrial companies, whether they're small companies, whether they're service sector companies, actually investing in their businesses upgrading their capital stock. That is, what is very, very exciting. And of course, is the key driver for financial markets. Nobody in financial markets expects a consumer-led recovery, but the reinvestment in business, the corporate metabolism, the fact that mergers and acquisitions keep on rising, the fact that, more and more shareholder proposals are being accepted by CEOs of corporations. This corporate metabolism is what drives the Japanese system further. And in my personal opinion, the irony is that the fact of America imposing tariffs on Japan actually is another catalyst for corporate Japan to reinvest in their business, to focus on their core competence. So, you've got all the elements that make the world of investment in Japan exciting, which is corporate activity, corporate metabolism, right? The market for corporate control now exists. You and I can challenge a Japanese CEO in a public forum, and that's where it gets interesting in terms of capital markets, and ultimately where it gets interesting in terms of the industrial reorganization that is actually taking place here in Japan.
Well, that is very exciting and very significant. I mean, and of course, one should remember that a flip in terms of inflation, deflation, a flip side of the pain that this is giving to pensioners is that the value of the cash sitting on corporate balance sheets is going down once you've got inflation, so that the incentive to start to invest it increases, which is part of, I imagine, what's going on. How do you see, before we bring Iida-san in, how do you see the yen, but also perhaps connected to it, the spirit of Japan in terms of investing overseas, and in particular in US assets, which used to be, if you like, the safe place to put all your cash?
Yeah, it's very interesting, Bill, because you actually, at the margin, you actually have conversations in all the important investors here in Japan, rethinking their global asset allocation.
Mm.
And of course, America is a deep liquid market, and but there are obvious issues, and the risk and the probability of some form of capital controls or a tax for global investors, which got taken out of the big, beautiful budget bill, as you remember.
Yes.
But the idea that we all, over the last 30, 40 years, we could always assume that capital was going to be treated best in the United States of America. That no longer necessarily applies. And the Japanese investors, at least the ones that I speak to, very, very interesting, Bill, they are beginning to focus again on China. So, there's looking at the People's Republic of China, both in terms of public markets investments as well as in terms of private investments. You're aware that several of the large industrial companies over the last couple of months have announced new commitments to build factories and operations in the People's Republic of China, most prominently Toyota Corporation, committing, I think $2 or $2.5 billion to build a new factory in the People's Republic of China. So, this idea of thank you. We love America and we want to do as much as possible with the United States of America, but divesting away from America, putting incremental new investments into Asia Pacific, including the People's Republic of China. That's where it's going to get very interesting.
No, and I think that is fascinating about Toyota. You're quite right. I mean, in Europe, if you like if I may use your language, the zeitgeist, as we say in English, is is somewhat that the car industry has lost its place in China and is in some ways devastated both at home and in China. The fact, and VW, Volkswagen in particular, having lost its great cash cow as it's perceived in Europe, whereas Toyota is doubling down on the investment in China, which is, I think, a fascinating juxtaposition of decisions.
Well, I think, look, at the end of the day, and I've given several presentations recently to CEOs of large industrial manufacturers here in Japan, and at the end of the day, the question of will America come back as a champion of free trade? And again, that's a huge leap of faith at this particular point in time. Now America can change very quickly, but I think that, preparing for a greater foothold in Indo-Pacific in particular, in the global South, specifically. The one thing, Bill, that is, since you mentioned Europe and you used zeitgeist, the one thing that is very, very difficult is the interest in Europe is not very strong.
Mm.
And that's sort of, yes, focus on Indo-Pacific very strongly, including the People's Republic of China, right? And revival of interest into Latin America, whereas some of the trading companies and some of the car companies actually have very good connectivity already and very good presence already. Mexico stays very much on the forefront, but Europe, you hear hardly anybody in the boardrooms talking about doing something in Europe.
Wow, that is quite chilling for us Europeans, maybe in a way. But Iida-san, let me introduce you. Welcome to the Japan Society. Please reveal yourself, as it were. There we are. No, you flashed off again.
Okay.
Welcome to the Japan Society and to Asia Society Tokyo, Kaori. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you
And
for having me.
it's a delight. And since we were talking about investments overseas just now, Jesper and I know that you have been and NHK have been talking a lot to Nippon Steel lately. Let's move straight on to that. Then with that way we can defer the tariff issue even further down the discussion by saying, I would say, looking back at our previous discussions, Jesper and I have generally been not positive about the idea that eventually Nippon Steel would succeed to
Hmm.
either buy or control US Steel, but Donald Trump can turn on a dime, and indeed he did. And now here it have it. How does that look to you? You've done an interview with I think Chairman Hashimoto of Nippon Steel. What explains it, and where is it going to go?
So thank you again for having me. It was not myself that did the interview, but I've been going to his press conferences, and one of my colleagues did an interview with him this past Friday. Um, Before I talk about the interview, I was kind of struck by how unpopular Nippon Steel is among the Japanese industrial, the CEOs and other leadership roles, because um, they've been very arrogant in a way. They're not a business to consumer company, they're a business to business company. And there was much criticism towards Nippon Steel for not handling the merger and acquisition very well, especially with regards to not communicating with the public or not communicating with the labor union beforehand. And I think many people, Japanese corporations in Washington, D.C., believe that they have hiked up the price for lobbyists. But having said that, I think it was the right move that they did, and I think it was the right move that the Trump administration made, because um, I don't think it was a national security issue. What was interesting about Hashimoto-san's interview was that he said that he brought up the word partnership, or Nippon Steel brought up the word partnership to President Trump. I always thought it was the president's side that brought it up, but he said that it was Nippon Steel's side that brought it up because they obviously thought that saying that they want to acquire 100% share would not fly with the administration or with Mr. Trump himself. And also, I thought it was interesting that it was Nippon Steel side that brought up the golden shares.
Mhm.
So that was my takeaway. And he talked about his philosophy. And at the very end, my colleague said that you almost sound like a samurai, a bushi. And he said that, no, I'm not a samurai. I'm just an inakamono, a countryman. So that was quite interesting for me.
And do you, I mean, both of you, Kaori and Jesper, I mean, this is a big investment in manufacturing in the United States by Nippon Steel. Obviously, to be inside the tariff, and I've mentioned that word tariff, inside the tariff wall around the United States. Do you see that being something that other Japanese corporations are interested in doing, investing inside the fortress America that is being created, or do you think that the emphasis is more going to be, as Jesper said, in diversifying, in making sure that you could supply the world from China or from Malaysia or from Indonesia or from India? How do you see it, Kaori? And then we'll come back to Jesper about investment in the US.
I guess it depends on which sector you're talking about. Nippon Steel made it clear that that was one of the reasons that they would want to invest in the United States because there is a high tariff, 50%, as many of you know. And they want to be inside the wall of the tariffs. Talking to other CEOs, I think it depends on which company you're talking about. But if you're an industry that has the capacity to go into the United States, I'm pretty sure that many companies would want to invest. But I agree with Jesper as well that many companies are trying to divest between other countries as well. A while ago, I think many companies were worried about having to decide on whether to be on the China team or on the US team. But right now, it seems like there's more leeway on, it's not an imminent choice that they have to make right now.
Right. Okay. Yeah, no, that presumably lies also behind Toyota's decision. Yes, but how do you? I mean, what is the flavor as far as the actual fixed investment in the U.S., foreign direct investment in the U.S. from Japanese companies, as well as the portfolio investment that we were.
So it's very interesting. If you look at the productive capital, right? First of all, you've got to remember that the presence of the key industries from Japan in the United States is already pretty large,
Yes.
right? This was the 1980s and 1990s when Japan revitalized single-handedly the American car industry, with building all the foreign transplants, over there. So steel is interesting, and as is well flagged, geostrategically, steel, America is in need of technology transfer. I mean, Nippon Steel just makes better steel, and I apologize, our American friends, but Americans have lost the ability to actually make the steel. I think even the Sherman tank now relies on foreign-made steel because they can't do this stuff anymore. So it's like the 1980s where the Japanese car industry gave the best and most modern production technology to the United States. This will now happen, thank God. In the steel industry. And it's a huge commitment. Obviously, the key worry ultimately is that Hashimoto-san, is such a great leader. He's got the charisma, he's got the vision. And I mean, I think every worker at Nippon Steel would work 24 hours, 7 days a week, under this man's leadership. There's a little bit of a worry. Is there a key man risk? What happens, when Hashimoto retires from the company? Is there still going to be the zest and the leadership? Can he actually build that next generation team that actually makes 1 + 1 = 4, in terms of the US Steel merger? And then, so that I think is some of the issues. The other issue, Bill, is what I encounter is vis-a-vis the United States of America and productive investment, that basically it's a wait and see attitude, that Trump is going to burn out, that the midterms are going to turn him into a lame duck, that this is this sort of first tsunami in the first 100 or 200 or 300 days that they do all this crazy stuff. but that sooner or later reason is going to start to return, and that as a result of that, a wait and see attitude vis-a-vis direct investment in America is the dominant force, while a refocusing on Asia Pacific, including China, is really something, the sort of top CEOs, are contemplating about.
Well,
How do you?
can I,
Yeah, yeah, please,
can I,
Kaori.
yeah, thank you. Can I build on what Jesper just said about the workers? I think what was interesting also with regards to the Nippon Steel-US Steel merger is that Nippon Steel was pretty made it clear that they wanted the workers. And talking to other companies, other Japanese manufacturing companies that would want to go to the United States to invest in the US, they're having a very hard time finding workers that would want to work in factories. And Nippon Steel was saying that US Steel still has that workforce, which are committed to making good steel. And also what Jesper just talked about, the next generation at Nippon Steel. Talking to some of my friends at Nippon Steel, that was interesting that the young people are excited about this. And you know how Japanese corporations like ours at NHK also, but it takes time when you want to make a decision. You have to go up the ladder, you have to come down the ladder again. But for this merger, they had to commit really quickly. So they would assemble like a Zoom. I'm not sure if it's a Zoom or a Teams, but they would have a video call with the chairman, with the CEO, and with the young people who are do public relations and also do the litigations, the law paperwork, and so they have a new team. They have a next generation team that is really focused and quick to decide. So I think that was another aspect that was very interesting with this current merger.
Bill, I think that there is one industry that we should watch out for, which is shipbuilding.
Yes, absolutely.
So the Americans, I mean, again, these are crude statement, but for example, President Trump is very focused on the ice caps melting, and as a result of that, the polar routes becoming available. But the problem is that America doesn't have any icebreakers, while Japan happens to build the best icebreakers in the world. So, some form of joint venture, in the shipbuilding business, right, which is what America also needs, right?
Yes.
I think that's one area where I certainly am very keen on, and it comes on, as you know. I mean, there's some movements here to consolidate the domestic shipbuilding industry at the same time. So a Japanese national champion, being created in the shipbuilding area, also with a foot in the United States of America, I think is something that we are likely to be seeing.
Now, that would be fascinating, and it fits, of course, entirely with the defense industrial base concepts that the Trump team are pushing. These 25% tariff threat. Let's just talk about that for a moment, or really tariff 25, 10, whatever it turns out to be. How important do both of you think it is from the point of view of Japanese business? Obviously, specific businesses care about it, but how important is it, Kaori, this issue? It's, of course, the talk of the town. Everybody talks about it, but that's because Donald Trump likes to be a center of attention.
Like Elon Musk does too, but yes.
Yes.
So if this 25% tariff, the reciprocal tariffs go through on August 1st, it would hit almost all of Japanese exports. So the auto industry with 25%, the steel industry with 50%, and the rest, aside from the semiconductor industry and pharmaceuticals, everything's going to be hit by at least 25% if this goes through. This is really big, I think. But today, the Japanese markets were pretty calm. It wasn't like Liberation Day when everything was a sell-off. So I think the mood here is a wait and see process. I think people, the markets, and the people in the government see this as a 3-week extension of the negotiation process. But if this actually goes through, this is really big. But it might be a taco Trump moment. I don't know.
Right. So that, well, or at least that this is the beginning of a negotiation, and the markets must be assuming that it actually lands in at somewhere between 10 and 20%, shall we say.
I guess since President Trump earlier this month said that Japan could be hit by a 30% or a 35% tariff rate, 25% seems much lower. But when you think
Yes.
about it, it's 1% higher than the original tariff, 24%, and it's much higher than the baseline tariff. So when you really think about it, I think it's going to be a huge damage.
It's interesting. I mean, if you just do the maths, right? 18% of corporate profits for Japan's listed companies come from dealing with the United States of America. So if you have a 25% tariff, and even in the worst case, where the companies pay for everything, that basically is a hit of around 5-6 percentage points maximum to Japanese corporate profits, which is not nothing. I mean, 5-6%, but given that companies have reserves of basically 1 times GDP, from an investment perspective, the damage to the cyclicality of earnings is less important. More important is the loss of confidence of how to do business with the United States. That's the much bigger issue, because the problem, and I must give, Akazawa-san and his team, I think they deserve a huge amount of credit, because you're not giving in to this stupidity of signing a piece of paper that is really, what is the covenant? What is the governance? Is this something that is reliable, or is this something that is subject to, if in 3 weeks' time, the president has some grudge against Japan, he's gonna, do something new again? They want a covenant, like a genuine new trading system. Fine. You want us to pay a surcharge, to be a member of the American club. That's fine. And whether that's 10% or 25%, that's not interesting. What is interesting is the failure of the White House, at least at this point in time, to actually have a believable, credible plan that actually allows you to do long-term planning, which is what I need. If I'm a Japanese industrial company or any company, right, I'm not interested in making it from here to Christmas, right? I'm interested in making it from here through to, the next 20 years. And that is, of course, the real challenge, and I think that Japan, the negotiating team, deserves a lot of credit for not giving in.
Yes.
For sticking to their ground and said, we want something that is credible, that is enforceable, and that is not going to be changed around, minute by minute by minute by minute.
Yeah, and they're absolutely right. That must be the case. Do you see that nerve holding, Kaori, as we approach whatever the next deadline is?
The next deadline seems to be August 1st. The tariff rate may not hit the earnings as much, but I think it would hit the sentiment in Japan, where the wages were at least going up a teensy bit. And once everything's about, all the news is about the tariffs today and probably this week also, I think it's more about the sentiment that the wages might not go up. And as you've been talking about, inflation is going up. So I think it's more about the sentiment rather than the earnings itself.
And where does the yen fit in with this? I mean, clearly it's taking it over the course of the year. It's been strengthening, but not that actually all that rapidly, but it's 145 or so, isn't it? I mean, to the dollar now. If the Bank of Japan takes your advice, Jesper, they should be raising interest rates to try to control this demand pull inflation. Will that then push up the yen again further? And does that then put even more of a squeeze on these exporters' profits?
So it's very interesting, and I think we had this talk before. I mean, I've learned the hard way that if you want to make money trading dollar yen, you need to focus on the Federal Reserve. It's all about the Federal Reserve, because the one thing that will happen, I believe that Governor Ueda and his team will continue to normalize interest rates. But this will be very gradual. This will be 25 basis points increments, with 6 to 9 months periods, in between. While, if and when America rolls over, unemployment starts to rise, and a real recession risk comes into view, that Mr. Powell or whoever it's going to be is going to stand in front of a microphone after having cut by 50 basis points, telling you that he will not hesitate to cut another 100 basis points. And that's what's going to drive the yen stronger. That's what's going to drive the dollar down. Here in Japan, for all intents and purposes, yes, inflation is a problem, and yes, it is becoming more demand pull inflation. At the same time, sort of risking the destruction of demand, right? In, this, what is still a relatively fragile environment, particularly for the Japanese consumer, sort of is a big concern. And then the other thing is that, the Japanese secondary banking system, the regional banks, some of the Shinkin banks, what are they called? Credit cooperatives, these sort of things, for them, they will be hit, by rising interest rates. The big banks, the primary banking system, the insurance companies, they're all making money hand over fist because finally there's a yield curve in Japan. But, the regional banks, the credit cooperatives, the secondary banking system, their risk management systems are not very strong. And so there's a fine line that the Bank of Japan needs to work as well, because unfortunately the secondary banking system is not very, very good at managing rising interest rate risk.
Now, let me encourage at this point members of our audience to place their questions into the Q&A function on Zoom. Questions about any topic that you like, of course, and then I will pick them out and try them on our colleagues here. One person did put a question in chat about, will the yen strengthen in the near future? I think we've just in effect answered that. Let me ask a question to you both that comes back to your corporate metabolism point, Jesper, but also fits with a question that's on here about the climate for financial services in Japan. And I add my own twist to it, which is that I saw a quote from our friend Yamaji-san at Tokyo Stock Exchange, saying that he thought the task of cleaning up corporate governance was about 20% done. I saw, and I thought, wow, that's quite a samurai statement to say that we've only just got going, in effect. Do you think that that's right? Is there really a lot more going to come in terms of the systemic change as opposed to the change from the people in companies? Kaori-san, do you see is there still a storm to come in terms of corporate governance reforms?
The annual share meetings were held in June, as you know.
Yes.
And there was much talk about the activists. So things are changing, but I really don't have an opinion on that right now. I was kind of curious on the next question about the LDP leadership. I wasn't really concentrating on your question. I'm sorry.
Oh no, but okay, we'll come to that. That's in chat. We'll come back to the LDP.
Maybe
but
the
yes,
LDP leader, maybe the LDP leadership could be a stalwart of proper corporate governance or proper governance. But but look, seriously, I mean, it is actually quite remarkable, how relatively little has actually changed in terms of corporate governance, right? There's an ongoing process, and it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. And so you see, whether it is shareholder proposals, whether it is outside directors, whether it is female directors, whether it is, share buybacks, et cetera, you do see steady progress, but it's not a big quantum jump, that you actually see. And I think from my discussions with Yamaji, there's actually a degree of frustration in the sense of that, fine, 2 years ago, price to book above one, you need to show a strategy to exceed your cost of capital, all these rudimentary basics of corporate finance. Now Japan should be doing it. But then when you look at what actually has happened, how many companies actually have a plan, I mean, it's not particularly impressive. And so from that perspective, I think, there's great progress. And hell, I'm in this business, right? But and certainly the landscape has changed in the sense of that there is a willingness and attraction to the whole thing. But is this something super radical? I think the answer is not. This is steady progress, and maybe that's a good thing to actually go about. What is interesting is that what Toyota is doing to Toyota Industries, right? Buying the company back in and reducing the premium that they are prepared to pay is starting to shift the debate away from just lazy balance sheets and corporate governance towards minority shareholders. And that's very, very important. And if you look at the data in terms of, if you have an MBO, if you have a management buyout versus a leveraged buyout, right? The differences in the premia are horrendous. And certainly, there's a lot of governance reform that needs to be done so that the outside directors or the directors of the companies are actually also responsible for ensuring that minority shareholder rights, are going to be protected. This is very, very important. And the Tokyo Stock Exchange now is working on kind of like what the Americans call a Revron rule, that you as an outside director, you as a director of a company do have a responsibility towards minority shareholders, and how that can actually be enforced here in Japan.
Yes, no, that's an important change, particularly in those kind of keiretsu type companies and also family owned companies where typically family shareholders have been given a certain priority over minority shareholders. Yes.
Bill, let's call a spade a spade. It's about the baby boom generation, basically dying off, and people want to minimize their inheritance tax. I mean, that is, and just to be very blunt, if you look at Taisei Pharmaceuticals, it happened last year. I mean, that company was taken private. If you take out the cash at a price to book of 0.3, I mean, that's stealing from minority shareholders, but thank you, the family got a reduced tax rate, right?
There's a story. Exactly. Now let me check. Let's go to the LDP because we've got a couple of questions about that, and then I'll move to some of the other questions. The future of the LDP leadership, Gary Stanton asked, as Kaori spotted, and also another questioner has asked, will Ishiba-san remain Prime Minister, remain head of the LDP? Do you think, in particular, perhaps because of discussions with the Trump administration? What's your perspective, Kaori? What do you?
Obviously, it will depend on what's going to happen on the 20th elections. In the Japanese media, the safest answer for the next leadership for the LDP is to say Hayashi Yoshimasa, Hayashi-san.
Right, Hayashi-san, foreign minister.
That's the.
Yes.
Not the foreign minister right now, the chief cabinet minister.
No, the former foreign minister. Sorry, yes.
Yes, yeah. You're correct. Yes. That's the safest answer among the Japanese media. it's interesting to see how Koizumi-san, Shinjiro, is going to do. And another politician I have my eye on is people like Shiozaki-san. His father was the health minister. He's pretty young. He's very energetic. He has an international background, and he's on the ground. So not right away, but maybe in the near future. But to answer the original question, the safest answer is to say Hayashi-san.
Right. Jesper, do you have a sense of this?
Oh, I think that the crisis in the LDP is only just beginning. And obviously Kaori is absolutely right. I mean, like you walk one step at a time in politics, and we've got this election here. Remarkable, classic LDP in the sense of that, let's not challenge the incumbent when our opinion polls are so low. Let's wait for them to go lower and then stab him in the back. Which has happened, Bill, during your and mine,
Yes.
some interactions with Japan at least 4 or 5 times, during this period. So the knives are being, put in place and maybe being sharpened, but there's no strong challenger. And the other thing is that when you actually look at the content, there are no clear answers in terms of what to do. Like, what should you do against rising inflation? And, obviously, oh my God, let's cut the consumption tax, right? Let's cut the consumption tax for food items so that for a couple of months, food prices are going to be lower. I mean, this is obviously idiotic.
Yeah.
Given that, it's not a one-off thing, that the sources of inflation are much more structural. And quite frankly, and look, I'm a huge Japan optimist, but right now, the dearth of constructive policy ideals to deal with domestic issues is really quite astounding, particularly within the LDP. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that anybody who, and I'm showing my own bias, but anybody who had interesting ideas that dealt with the supply side, they were all part of the Abe and Suga team, right? Because these were people who'd been in power for a long time. You would invest your capital with them, and they were very open to actually experiment with interesting ideas that go against the established consensus. Now, still, the Abe faction, and the people around it are still under attack for all intents and purposes. And as a result of that, there's just, I mean, whatever happened to Kishida's new capitalism? I mean, great slogan. Anything concrete? Not really. Any interesting people, who have interesting ideas or even controversial ideas who advise the LDP at this point in time? The answer is no, quite the opposite. You've got the Sanseto, for example, right, being much more inquisitive amongst, whether it's academics or whether it's business people trying to sort out ideas. So I think that this storm within the LDP is just beginning to brew, and it's going to get very, very interesting. The upshot of this election result is going to be one thing, which is that the power of the bureaucrats is going to get stronger. And it's very interesting, Bill. We've now had this summer, the rotation of the bureaucrats, the appointments of the senior positions. Not one of them was vetoed by the Prime Minister's office. Under Abe and Suga, 1/3 of the people proposed for senior positions in the bureaucracy in the annual rotations were, denied. And Suga and Abe put in the people that they wanted. Since basically Kishida, and again with Ishiba, it's now the bureaucrats running the show. And the bureaucrats know full well that whoever is going to be elected, I'm not going to invest my capital into that person because toriaizu, for the time being, the Japanese political system is going to be in flux until a strong new leader actually starts to come through.
Yes, no, that's that's a very powerful statistic. I hadn't realized that. Now,
I was
just
looking, I was
go on,
looking at the
Kaori.
poll, NHK polls that we put out this week. Jesper talked about the cut of the consumption taxes, and 52% of the people that we polled are saying that they want a reduction or the abolishment of the consumption tax, 52%. And 17% are saying that they would rather have a handout. And looking at what the key topics are for the elections, it's rice and inflation, that's 28%, and 28% are saying health insurance, and only 9% are saying tariffs.
Right, right. Yeah, no, that puts it in great perspective. Let me pick up some more of the questions here. Now, one question is in a way the flip side of that inflation question, which is about the bond market. The questioner says, please comment on long Japanese government bond sell-offs and sharply rising yields. How should we think about that, both of you? Is this the
Let's ask
crisis that
Jesper.
we've all been dismissing for 30 years, finally coming along because of inflation?
No, but look, I mean, again, it's wonderful when things work the way they're supposed to work. In the sense of that I have inflation, that inflation is not going to go away, and as a result of that, the bond market, is actually reacting in exactly the way it's supposed to be. Now, you can buy a Japanese 30-year bond, and it's still yielding less than inflation. So
Yes.
real interest rates, even at the super long end, are negative, which is, in my personal opinion, absurd. And, we are, in my personal opinion, going to continue to see a further steepening of Japanese interest rates. What is interesting is that the Bank of Japan and the Ministry of Finance are superb in their coordination. And I mean, I can't, if I compare this to Europe, if I compare this to what goes on, even in the People's Republic of China, the moment there is a dislocation in one part of the bond market, right, the MOF and the Bank of Japan get their heads together and start to coordinate. And as you know, the Ministry of Finance has changed the duration profile of what's going to be issued. And the Bank of Japan has reduced the reductions of its bond buying operation. So they are incredibly responsive to what goes on in the market, and they're incredibly coordinated in terms of the issue of the Ministry of Finance and the Bank of Japan. So it's very, very interesting that we can talk about politics, but it's irrelevant in the sense of that the elite bureaucracy actually is extremely well coordinated, at least in terms of financial market management.
And picking up on another question here, the sort of portfolio side of something we were talking about earlier. I wonder if either of you have a review about this. John Nasher said, talking about Japan's international reserves. Is there any significant move away from the US dollar in terms of those international reserve holdings, which Japan is the biggest, at least official, I mean the biggest holder of US treasuries, I believe, outside the US.
Yeah,
Do you
very
see a trend
interesting,
there?
Bill. It's very interesting, Bill, because empirically, and this is weekly data that is available, the only thing that has happened is they've diversified out of Europe.
Out of Europe. Mm-hmm.
Right? Out of Europe. And, the dollar is the dollar is the dollar, still stays in place. And they are certainly not thinking about Bitcoin.
Just a quick question. Why are they diversifying out of Europe?
It's very interesting. I think that the lack of transparency in the European governance, I think, is one of the issues that is there. Plus, also, that from a reserve management perspective, the fact that you've got reduced exports and imports from the European community also warrants a little bit of a reduction, right? I mean, for your reserves, you should have some import cover of the currency denomination of your imports. So if your imports from Europe fall, right, then your euro-based reserves should be reduced.
Oh.
We're not going to see any Bitcoins in the Japanese reserves anytime soon, but do you think crypto might become a part of the reserve of the United States?
Huh. Who knows what happens in look, I mean, the answer is absolutely yes. And because I mean it's very clear that the if you look through the fog of what comes out of the White House, in particular, the Treasury, as well as the new head of the SEC in the United States, are
Mhm.
very focused on crypto. And I think that it's only going to be a question of time, before the United States actually makes that way. The more interesting one, since we're talking about crypto, which is a completely different topic, is ultimately, the steadfast week by week increase in liquidity of the Chinese settlement system and the Chinese, central bank based, cryptocurrencies, which is very, very interesting. So if there is a diversification, it's interesting. A lot of the analysts look at, is the value of the dollar as a reserve currency falling or not, and you can't show it empirically. But that's because the whole global South is not using the custodians that and the custodian methods that the People's Republic of China is actually offering them via their crypto businesses, right? So there's actually a shadow reserve positions that are being built from the global South.
Right. Yes. No. Well, so and all of our focus on whether the renminbi needs to become convertible before China becomes a significant player in that, maybe that we're looking in the wrong direction, is what you're saying.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's
No. That's so interesting. So interesting. Now, I mean, we just have 3 or 4 minutes left. One question I wanted to get Jesper to talk about, since you're at NHK, you might also have a view of this. One thing that you said on your recent talk with the podcast that you circulated, was it Money Talks or something? I forget the name of the podcast now. Was that you saw Japanese media companies as being big future investors and operators in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, in Southeast Asia in particular, I think. And you saw not the new Netflix was not going to be from Hollywood. It was going to be from somewhere in Tokyo. Talk about that, and we'll see what Kaori thinks.
Look, I'm super excited about the Japanese media sector. And, look, and the reason is number one, the content is there. I've got the content. I've been very lazy, in selling my content. And, it doesn't take much to jazz up the content to make it so that it's not a core audience of a 68-year-old Japanese woman in Niigata, but that it's a 28-year-old woman in Indo-Pacific, and so that I think is starting to happen. And, the reality of Fuji Media having imploded itself, right? And the absurdity of the protection of a broadcasting license that foreign investors can only own 20% of it. All of this is starting to come together. And I think, you will see whether it's TBS, whether it's even Fuji, whether it's, the media groups in Japan are going to be the new Yoji Yamamoto's and Issey Miyake on the global scene.
How do you
Hmm.
see that, Kaori, as a final word from the heart of NHK?
And Fuji TV and TBS are not really content providers, but they're more of investors now. So I'm not really sure about that, but
TBS makes the best dramas in Japan.
says who?
Oh, okay.
But no. Having attention on the Japanese content, anime, dramas, I think it's good. But on the other hand, companies like Netflix, they're investing in companies in France. They've cooperated with NASA Plus recently, so I think they're becoming a much larger platformer. in which case that Japanese content providers, not the media companies itself, but content providers can, I think, sell their content to companies like YouTube or like to Netflix, but I'm not really sure about the Japanese media. Not that excited about it myself.
So there we are. We've got yes, we've got a contrasting set of views, which is terrific. We will watch this space. I'm sure we will come back to this issue, Jesper. I think it's fascinating, but also thanks for a terrific conversation, both of you, Kaori Iida and Jesper Koll. We've covered a wide range of things, from inflation through Nippon Steel, through shipbuilding, through treasuries, through crypto, and of course those beastly tariffs. We will see you again in 3 months' time at the next Japan Macro Salon. And meanwhile, I thank all the audience for joining. Thank you for your great questions, and thank you again to you both for sparing the time to be with us. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great evening.
Good night.
Ciao.
Bye.